The courthouse hallway smelled like floor wax and broken promises. 8-year-old Emma Henderson stood frozen in the middle of that cold, imposing corridor, her small fingers wrapped so tightly around Bailey's leather leash that her knuckles had turned white. Her golden retriever, 3 years old, with a coat the color of honey and eyes that held more wisdom than most humans possessed, pressed his warm body against her leg, sensing the tremor running through his young companion. Emma's grandmother stood beside them both, a 68-year-old woman whose own hands were shaking despite her decades of life experience. The courthouse was a fortress of authority and judgment. Marble columns stretched toward a ceiling that seemed impossibly high. Emma's neck ached from looking up at the architectural enormity surrounding her. People in suits hurried past with briefcases and expressions of practiced indifference, as if the emotional turmoil of others was simply background noise in their daily professional existence. The echo of footsteps created a symphony of dread. Emma's heart hammered against her ribs with the intensity of a trapped bird, each beat sending waves of anxiety through her small body. She wore a pink dress, pale pink, almost rose-colored, that her mother had selected 3 weeks ago during what now felt like an entirely different lifetime. That was before the lawyers got involved, before the protective orders, before Emma's world had fractured into sharp, dangerous pieces. The dress had a small white collar and matching ribbon in her hair. She looked innocent, vulnerable, and unbearably sad. Had insisted on the dress, believing that appearing innocent and well cared for might somehow influence the judge's perspective. Emma wasn't sure if a dress could make a difference, but she'd because compliance was what she did now. Compliance kept her safe, or at least that's what she'd learned. Bailey hadn't been part of the original plan. For months, Emma had carried this burden alone, her nightmares growing more vivid, her appetite diminishing, her childhood evaporating like morning dew. Her mother had noticed the changes, the way Emma flinched at sudden sounds, how she'd begun having accidents at night despite being potty trained for 6 years, the increasing frequency of her stomach aches that doctors couldn't explain. When Emma finally disclosed what had happened during those visitation weekends with her mother's ex-partner, everything had exploded into chaos. Police reports, interviews with Child Protective Services, custody battles, a protective order, and now this. Dr. Emma's therapist had suggested Bailey about 2 months ago. Emma remembered that session vividly, sitting in Doctor's calming office with its soft blue walls and gentle lighting, where even the air seemed less threatening than in the rest of the world. Doctor had explained that emotional support animals could help children feel less alone during traumatic moments. Emma's mother had been skeptical at first. "We already have a dog at home," she'd said. But Doctor had been persistent, explaining the difference between a regular pet and an animal trained specifically to respond to emotional distress signals. Bailey had come from a specialized program that trained golden retrievers to work with trauma survivors. Emma's mother's insurance had covered most of the cost, though her grandmother had chipped in for the remainder. For 8 weeks, Emma and Bailey had worked with Doctor on their bonding exercises. They'd practiced the signals, the gentle taps on Bailey's shoulder that would trigger his trained response. They'd practiced in safe environments, the therapist's office, Emma's bedroom, the local park. Bailey had learned to recognize Emma's panic signals and respond with grounding techniques that seemed almost miraculous in their effectiveness. Bailey himself had a story. He'd been rescued from an abusive situation 3 years ago and had been rehabilitated by a woman named who ran a training facility outside the city. Instead of harboring resentment toward humans, Bailey had become one of the most empathetic creatures Emma had ever encountered. It was as though his own trauma had given him the ability to recognize suffering in others and respond with extraordinary gentleness. Now, standing in this intimidating hallway, Emma could feel Bailey's steadiness bleeding into her. His coat was immaculate. His owner had bathed and groomed him that morning with meticulous care. His tags jingled softly with each breath he took. Around his neck was a vest identifying him as an emotional support animal, though Emma suspected that vest wouldn't matter much once they entered the courtroom. Nothing had seemed to matter much lately except survival. Squeezed Emma's shoulder gently, a gesture meant to be comforting but which only amplified Emma's awareness of how fragile this entire situation was. Her grandmother had been her rock through all of this. It was who had taken Emma to every therapy appointment, who had driven her to the police station for her statement, who had held her through countless nightmares, who had believed her immediately and completely, without the hesitation that sometimes flickered in other adults' eyes. "You're going to be so brave in there," whispered, bending down slightly so that her words were meant only for Emma's ears. "Just tell the truth. That's all you have to do. Just tell the truth." Emma nodded mutely. She understood what was at stake. Her mother had explained it in terms an 8-year-old could grasp. If the judge believes you, then you never have to spend time with him again. If the judge doesn't believe you, then you'll have to go with him sometimes, and I know that scares you. This oversimplification of the legal system had terrified Emma for weeks. She'd become obsessed with the idea of being disbelieved. What if her words came out wrong? What if she forgot important details? What if the man in the suit, the one called opposing counsel, managed to confuse her into saying something that made her sound like a liar? The bailiff appeared at the end of the hallway, a heavy-set man with a radio clipped to his belt and an expression of bureaucratic disinterest. "Emma Henderson," he called out. His hand tightened on Emma's shoulder. This was it, the moment she'd been dreading and simultaneously rushing toward for months. Emma took a deep breath. Bailey's presence beside her felt like an anchor, keeping her tethered to something solid and real and unconditionally loving. She hadn't asked for this situation. She hadn't asked for a man to violate her boundaries and destroy her sense of safety. She hadn't asked for custody battles and courtrooms and the complicated machinery of justice that seemed designed to intimidate rather than protect. But here she was, 8 years old, carrying the weight of truth that adults had failed to protect her from needing to carry. "Come on, sweetheart," said softly, guiding her forward. Bailey walked beside Emma with the calm purposefulness of a creature who understood his role was to be present, to be steady, to be a living reminder that she wasn't truly alone. As they approached the courtroom doors, Emma caught her reflection in one of the polished brass fixtures on the wall. She looked impossibly small, impossibly fragile. She looked like exactly what she was, a child terrified of being disbelieved, of being forced back into danger, of navigating a system designed for adults in a body that barely reached the judge's eye level when she stood. Bailey nudged her hand gently with his nose, his way of saying, "I'm here. I've got you." Emma managed a small smile. Then, with her grandmother on one side and her faithful companion on the other, she pushed through the heavy wooden doors of the courtroom, ready to fight for her own safety and dignity. The judge was going to laugh. She didn't know it yet, but she would learn that soon enough. The courtroom was a cathedral of authority and power, designed specifically to intimidate. High ceilings stretched upward into shadow, paneled walls the color of old mahogany enclosed the space, and everything smelled like polished wood and the faint metallic tang of authority. Rows of wooden benches, like church pews, Emma thought, faced the judge's elevated bench, which resembled a throne more than a seat of judgment. The American flag and the state flag hung solemnly in the corners. Everything about the room screamed, "This is serious. This matters. Your voice is very, very small here." Judge Harrison sat behind that imposing bench like a king surveying his kingdom. At 63 years old, with silver hair swept back from a strong forehead and reading glasses hanging from a cord around his neck, he commanded the space through sheer presence. He'd been on the bench for 32 years, 32 years of divorce cases, custody battles, and the messy dissolution of families. He'd heard every excuse, every manipulation, every attempt to bend the truth into a shape more palatable to his judgment. 32 years had calcified his skepticism into something close to contempt for human weakness. Judge prided himself on his reputation. He ran a tight courtroom, no nonsense, No excuses. No accommodations beyond what the law strictly required. His peers respected him, or feared him, which he considered roughly equivalent. He had a 94% appellate affirmation rate, meaning his decisions rarely got overturned on appeal. This wasn't because he was brilliant, though he was reasonably intelligent. It was because he was rigid, predictable, and unwilling to deviate from precedent in ways that might be questioned. Conservative judges rarely get reversed. That morning, Judge had already presided over 3 cases. A corporate lawsuit had bored him. A traffic violation had irritated him with its pedestrian nature. A minor property dispute had seemed like a waste of his considerable talents. He was in a mood, the kind of mood that comes from a man who believes his intellect is underutilized, and his time is constantly being wasted by lesser beings who fail to understand the gravity of judicial proceedings. He was reviewing files for the Henderson custody hearing when the bailiff, officer, a man who'd worked this courthouse for 20 years, ushered in the plaintiff's side of the case. That's when Judge saw her. The girl was impossibly small. 8 years old, the file said, but she looked barely 7. She wore a pale pink dress that hung on her frame like it might slip off at any moment, and her hand trembled as she gripped the leash of a golden retriever. The dog walked calmly beside her, its movements deliberate and precise in a way that suggested training. But to Judge, none of that mattered. What he saw was a dog in his courtroom. An animal. An intrusion. He set down his pen slowly and looked up from his papers, his eyes narrowing behind his reading glasses as they focused on the girl and the golden retriever. For a moment, he said nothing. He simply stared, as if the universe had personally insulted him by bringing a dog into his sacred space. Then he smiled. It wasn't a warm smile. It was the smile of a man who had just been given ammunition for a cutting remark. "Is this a courtroom or a dog park?" he asked, his voice projecting clearly across the chamber. The words landed like pebbles thrown into still water, creating ripples that spread throughout the room. Several spectators in the gallery, lawyers waiting for their own cases to be called, courthouse workers, a social services representative, shifted in their seats and exchanged nervous glances. One of the lawyers near the back actually chuckled. Then another joined in, a nervous titter that seemed to encourage Judge's mockery. Emma felt her blood freeze in her veins. Beside her, his jaw tightened, though she maintained her composure. Bailey, sensing the sudden shift in emotional temperature around him, pressed more firmly against Emma's leg. Judge removed his reading glasses entirely now, letting them hang by their cord as he leaned back in his high-backed leather chair with an expression of exaggerated bemusement. "Officer," he said, addressing the bailiff with theatrical formality, "did I miss a memo? Did we convert this courthouse into some kind of petting zoo while I was at lunch?" More nervous laughter rippled through the courtroom. Officer's face reddened slightly, but he said nothing. He was well practiced in the art of absorbing his judge's moods without reaction. Emma's attorney, a woman named Sarah Mitchell who specialized in family law and had a reputation for being formidable but fair, stood quickly. She was 47, with steel-gray streaks in her dark hair and the bearing of someone who'd fought too many battles to be easily intimidated. "Your Honor, the emotional support animal was approved in our pretrial motions. The pet." "I don't care if it was approved by the Supreme Court itself," Judge interrupted, his tone suddenly sharp and dismissive. He waved his hand in that particular way that meant the conversation was over from his perspective, regardless of whether anyone else was finished speaking. "This is a serious legal proceeding, not a therapy session. We don't need circus animals in this courtroom." The word circus hung in the air like an accusation. Emma felt her face flush with shame, though she'd done nothing wrong. She was 8 years old, and the most powerful person in the room had just publicly humiliated her and Bailey in front of a dozen witnesses. Judge turned his attention fully to Emma now, and his expression was one of undisguised skepticism. "Where's the child's mother?" he asked. "In the waiting room, Your Honor," officer replied. "She'll be called when needed." The judge nodded slowly, his gaze lingering on Emma for a moment that felt impossibly long. In that gaze, Emma could read his conclusion. This was a custody battle driven by a vindictive mother using her daughter and a dog as props to gain sympathy. He'd made up his mind before hearing a single word of testimony. Mr. James, the opposing counsel, the lawyer representing Emma's mother's ex-partner, leaned back in his chair with a satisfied expression. He'd worked with Judge before and recognized the signs of judicial skepticism. The judge had telegraphed his leanings before the case had even truly begun, allowed himself a small, predatory smile. His hand found Emma's shoulder and squeezed it, trying to communicate wordlessly, "Don't fall apart. Not here. Not now," but even could see the damage that had been done. The judge had mocked them publicly. He dismissed their preparation and Emma's therapist's recommendations as circus performance. He'd established his prejudice before a single word of evidence had been presented. Sarah Mitchell's jaw clenched. She'd seen this before, judges who allowed their personal biases to color their judgment before the facts were even presented. It was one of the systemic flaws of the judiciary that kept her awake at night. But she kept her composure and said quietly, "We're ready to proceed with the witness when you are, Your Honor." Judge nodded dismissively and returned his attention to his papers, as if Emma, Bailey, and the entire case had already been decided. The contempt in his demeanor was suffocating. Emma felt tears prickling at the corners of her eyes but forced them back. She wouldn't cry. Not yet. Not until she was forced to. Bailey remained steady, pressed against her leg, a warm anchor in a room full of cold judgment. What Judge didn't understand, what his 32 years of rigid thinking had failed to teach him, was that sometimes the most important moments of justice don't look impressive or formal or dignified. Sometimes they look like a small girl and a golden retriever. Sometimes they arrive in vessels so humble that the powerful overlook them entirely. But this was only the beginning. The judge's mockery would soon become his education. His skepticism would become his awakening. And the very thing he was ridiculing would become the key that unlocked a truth he'd almost missed forever. The bailiff led Emma to the witness stand, a raised wooden platform that made her feel even smaller, if such a thing was possible. The bailiff's hand was gentle on her shoulder. Officer had worked with traumatized children before, and he treated them with a kindness that contrasted sharply with Judge's earlier mockery. Bailey, however, was directed to remain beside the attorney's table. Emma watched in panic as she was separated from her only source of comfort, her hands already beginning to shake. The Bible was ancient, its leather cover cracked with age and use. Officer placed Emma's small hand on its cover and the weight of it seemed impossibly heavy. She was asked to swear to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help her God. Emma's voice came out as barely a whisper, "I do." Once seated in the witness chair, which had a booster cushion so she could be seen at the proper height, Emma looked out at the courtroom. Directly ahead sat the man she'd been terrified to see, her mother's ex-partner. He was 41, with dark hair and a face that appeared normal, pleasant even, if you didn't know what lived behind his eyes. He wore a navy suit that probably cost more than Emma's mother made in a month. He looked like someone respectable. He looked like someone who could never hurt a child. That was the problem. Sarah Mitchell approached Emma with a gentle demeanor, her questions designed to establish the basics: Emma's age, where she lived, her school, her family structure. These were warm-up questions, designed to help Emma feel more comfortable before the difficult material. Emma answered softly but clearly, gaining slightly more confidence with each response. "Emma, can you tell me about your relationship with Mr.?" Sarah asked gently. Emma took a breath. "He was with my mom for 3 years. He lived with us for 2 years." "And how did you feel about him during that time?" Emma's jaw tightened. "At first it was okay, then it got bad." "Can you tell me what you mean by bad?" This was the moment. Emma knew it. This was where everything changed. Her therapist had prepared her for this question. Emma opened her mouth to speak, to finally give voice to the things that had been poisoning her from the inside out. That's when Mr. stood up. "Objection, Your Honor. This is leading and assumes facts not established." Judge looked up from his papers with an expression of utter indifference. "Overruled. The child is allowed to explain what she means. Continue, counsel." But something had shifted in the courtroom's energy. Objection, though overruled, had introduced an adversarial element. Emma suddenly understood that this wasn't simply a conversation. This was a battle, and she was the battlefield. "Take your time, Emma," Sarah said gently. "What happened that was bad?" Emma's hands began to tremble. She told how would make comments about her body, how he'd touched her inappropriately by accident in the kitchen when no one was looking, how he'd told her it was their special secret and that she shouldn't tell anyone because it would break up the family and it would be her fault. As Emma spoke, her voice grew quieter. The courtroom seemed to lean in, everyone listening intently, everyone except Judge, who was writing something in his file with an expression of administrative tedium. Sarah continued her examination, asking careful questions designed to establish the pattern and frequency of the abuse. Emma answered each one, and with each answer, she felt something cracking inside her. Memories she tried to suppress came flooding back. The smell of his cologne, the weight of his hand, the confusion of a child trying to process betrayal by someone she'd been taught to trust. Then it was his turn. He approached the witness stand like a predator, his movements deliberately slow and menacing. "Emma, isn't it true that you didn't tell anyone about these alleged incidents until 3 months after your mother and Mr. broke up?" "Yes, but—" "A simple yes or no will suffice," interrupted. "You waited 3 months to make these accusations. Why should the court believe these incidents actually happened?" Emma's heart began to race. She tried to explain about trauma, about being afraid, about the shame that had kept her silent, but wasn't interested in explanations. "Isn't it possible," he continued, his voice taking on a tone of false concern that made Emma's skin crawl, "that your mother, angry at Mr. for leaving, coached you to make these accusations? Children are highly suggestible, Emma. Did your mother ask you leading questions about Mr.?" "No, she—" "Did anyone else ask you these leading questions? Your therapist, perhaps?" "My therapist helps me, she—" "That's not an answer, Emma. Yes or no. Did your therapist ask you leading questions?" Emma felt tears beginning to form. Her breathing was becoming shallow. She looked toward Bailey, seeking his calm presence, but he was too far away. She couldn't feel his warmth. She couldn't access the grounding technique they'd practiced. Judge glanced up briefly. "Speak clearly, child. Your responses aren't clear." The judge's criticism, meant to be neutral instruction, landed like a blow. Emma felt judged. She felt disbelieved. She felt small and powerless and absolutely alone. Pressed onward, his questions becoming increasingly aggressive. He asked her to describe incidents in minute detail, then challenged inconsistencies in her memory, forgetting, of course, that traumatized children often remember trauma in fragmented ways, not in the neat chronological narratives that Suits preferred. Emma's hands clenched into fists. Her breathing became rapid and shallow. The walls of the courtroom seemed to be closing in. The air felt thick and unbreathable. She could feel her heart pounding in her throat, in her temples, behind her eyes. "What is the color of the shirt Mr. was wearing on that occasion?" demanded. I don't remember exactly. It was." "You remember him touching you inappropriately, but you don't remember what color shirt he was wearing. That's convenient, isn't it?" The room began to spin. Emma's vision blurred. She felt as though she was being attacked, her words being twisted, her truth being transformed into lies. The very act of testifying, of trying to protect herself, was harming her. "Your Honor," Sarah stood up, "the witness is clearly distressed. Perhaps we should take a recess." "We're not taking a recess," Judge said curtly. "Mr. Get to your point." Emma's breathing became a series of shallow, rapid gasps. Her chest felt tight, as though an invisible band had been wrapped around it and was slowly being tightened. She looked at her grandmother, hopping for rescue, but could only watch helplessly from the gallery, tears streaming down her face. "Your Honor, I object to the witness being subjected to this line of questioning without." Sarah tried again. "Your objection is noted and overruled," Judge said without even looking up from his papers. The panic was becoming unbearable. Emma felt as though she was drowning in air, as though the oxygen in the room had somehow been replaced with something toxic. Her hands shook so violently she could barely grip the edge of the witness stand. Black spots began appearing in her vision. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came. Only a small, desperate sound, something between a whimper and a cry. This was the breaking point. This was the moment when a child's attempt to tell the truth about her own violation was being transformed into an interrogation that felt very much like secondary victimization. This was the moment that everything changed. Emma's world was fragmenting. The courtroom had transformed into a hostile maze of sounds and sensations that made no sense. Judge's voice seemed to come from very far away, as though it was traveling through water to reach her ears. Continued questions felt like physical blows. The panic attack had fully seized control of her body, overriding her conscious will to remain composed. Her hands gripped the edge of the witness stand so tightly that her fingernails left small crescents in the wood. Her chest heaved with each shallow, desperate breath. The room tilted dangerously. The floor seemed to rise and fall like the deck of a ship in a storm. She tried to focus on something stable, something real, but everything was moving. Everything was collapsing. Was still speaking, his words now little more than unintelligible noise. "Don't you think the timing of these accusations is suspicious? Your mother's anger, difficult custody dispute." But Emma couldn't process language anymore. Language had become her enemy. Language was what was being used to dismantle her truth, to paint her as a liar, to suggest that her own violation was a fabrication born of parental manipulation. Black spots began dancing across her vision. Emma's breathing came in hitching gasps that didn't seem to bring any oxygen into her lungs. She felt as though she was suffocating while surrounded by air. Her body was sending emergency signals, flooding her system with cortisol and adrenaline, preparing her for a fight-or-flight response that the courtroom's formal structure didn't permit. Half rose from her seat in the gallery, but a bailiff's subtle shake of the head kept her seated. She was not permitted to go to her granddaughter. This was the law's way. Sarah Mitchell stood abruptly, her voice sharp with urgent concern. "Your Honor, I must object. The witness is having a medical emergency. She needs." "The witness is being questioned and will answer the questions." Judge cut her off, his tone suggesting that emotional distress was merely a manipulation tactic he would not tolerate. Emma felt utterly abandoned. The adults who were supposed to protect her were powerless. The system designed to help her was hurting her. She was 8 years old, and she was alone in a way that no child should ever be alone. That's when Bailey moved. The golden retriever, who had been lying calmly beside the attorney's table, suddenly rose to his feet with the purposeful urgency of a creature responding to an emergency. Bailey's instincts were finely tuned. 3 years of specialized training, combined with his own empathic nature, had given him the ability to recognize the specific patterns of a trauma response in the person he'd bonded with. Officer, who had been standing at the side of the courtroom, instinctively moved forward as if to prevent the dog from approaching the witness stand. But Sarah Mitchell raised her hand in a subtle gesture that stopped him. She understood what was happening. She recognized Bailey's trained response. Bailey moved through the courtroom with quiet determination, his movements deliberate and controlled. He didn't run. He didn't bark. He didn't create a disturbance. He simply walked with the gravity of a creature who understood his purpose. Judge looked up from his papers, momentarily distracted by the movement. "Bailiff," the judge began, his tone already turning dismissive, "remove that." But before Officer could move, Bailey reached Emma and did something extraordinary. He stood up on his hind legs, not aggressively but gently, and pressed his entire body firmly against Emma's trembling form. His weight, approximately 65 pounds of it, anchored her to reality. His warmth seeped through her pink dress. His presence, solid and real and unconditionally there, pierced through the fog of panic like a beam of light. The courtroom seemed to hold its breath. Emma's hands, which had been gripping the witness stand with desperate strength, instinctively released and moved to Bailey's fur. For a moment, nothing else happened. She simply held on to him, breathing in the familiar scent of his coat, that warm, earthy, beloved scent that had become synonymous with safety. Then Emma did something she had practiced 100 times with Doctor, but had hoped never to need in court. She made the signal. Her trembling right hand lifted from Bailey's fur and made 2 deliberate taps, firm, precise, on Bailey's shoulder. It was subtle enough that only someone looking directly at them would notice. It was a gesture that would mean nothing to anyone who didn't understand what it represented. But Bailey understood. The golden retriever lowered himself down from his standing position, but instead of stepping away, he remained pressed against Emma's side. He then gently turned his massive head and placed it directly on her lap, his chin resting on her legs, his eyes looking up at her with an expression of infinite compassion. The transformation was almost instantaneous. Within 10 seconds of Bailey's head settling on her lap, Emma's breathing began to slow. The shallow, panicked gasps became slightly deeper. Her hands, which had been shaking violently, steadied as she placed them on Bailey's head and neck. Her trembling subsided, the black spots receding from her vision. The tilting room slowly righted itself. The courtroom had become utterly silent. Every person present understood they were witnessing something significant, though perhaps not everyone comprehended exactly what they were seeing. Some might have assumed it was simply a comfort animal providing basic reassurance. But those with knowledge of trauma recognized something more profound. They were watching a trained response to a specific trigger, a deliberate communication between child and animal, a circuit of healing completing itself. Judge set down his pen. His skeptical expression shifted, not immediately to belief, but to something more important, genuine curiosity. His rigid posture softened almost imperceptibly. He was watching, really watching, not with contempt but with an emerging understanding that something significant was occurring in his courtroom. His aggressive posture deflated slightly. Even he, hardened by years of courtroom battles, recognized that the dynamic had shifted. Sarah Mitchell caught the judge's eye and nodded slightly, a silent communication. "This is what we've been trying to tell you about." Emma sat quietly for another moment, her hand resting on Bailey's head, drawing strength from the animal's grounding presence. When she finally looked up, something had changed in her expression. The terror was still there. Trauma doesn't disappear in 30 seconds, but it had been transformed into something manageable. The panic had been interrupted. The anxiety had been given an outlet. When she spoke, her voice was different, stronger, clearer. "I'm ready to answer your questions," she said quietly too. The opposing counsel seemed momentarily caught off guard. He exchanged a glance with his client, and Emma saw something flicker across the man's face. Uncertainty. For the first time, the abuser seemed unsure of his ability to manipulate the narrative. Judge leaned back in his chair, studying Emma and Bailey with an expression that had fundamentally changed. The mockery had drained from his features, replaced by something that looked disturbingly like recognition. He was seeing, perhaps for the first time, what he dismissed so carelessly. Not a circus performance, but a trained therapeutic intervention. Not a mother's manipulation, but a child's strategy for survival. Not weakness, but extraordinary resilience. "Mr. Judge," said quietly, "you may continue your questioning." But something in his tone, the removal of the earlier contempt, the subtle hint of warning, suggested that the terrain of this cross-examination had shifted fundamentally. Bailey remained motionless, his head still resting on Emma's lap, his eyes alert and present. The dog would remain in this position for the entire remainder of Emma's testimony, a living testament to the power of connection, training, and unconditional love. The courtroom had witnessed a miracle, though it would take some of them longer than others to recognize it as such. With Bailey's head resting on her lap like a living anchor, something fundamental shifted within Emma. The panic didn't disappear entirely. She could still feel it lurking at the edges of her consciousness, ready to surge back, but it had been transformed into something she could manage. The terror had become determination. The chaos had become focus. Emma took a deep breath, her small chest expanding and contracting in a rhythm that finally felt sustainable. She looked directly at, and for the first time, there was clarity in her eyes. Not the desperate clarity of someone fighting for survival, but the steady clarity of someone who had finally found solid ground. "I'm ready," she said again, her voice firmer this time. Seemed momentarily disconcerted by the transformation. The girl he'd been attacking had suddenly become present, grounded, coherent. He shuffled through his papers, searching for his next line of questioning, trying to recapture the momentum he'd had before Bailey had intervened. "So you claim that on March 15th touched you inappropriately," began, his tone still aggressive but slightly less confident. "Yet you couldn't remember details of this incident when asked moments ago." "I can remember now," Emma said quietly but firmly. Her hand remained on Bailey's head, drawing strength from him with each word. "I was scared before. Now I'm still scared, but I can tell you what happened." The court reporter's fingers flew across her keyboard, capturing Emma's words with the speed and precision of someone who'd been doing this for 20 years. This was important testimony, and somewhere in her professional consciousness, the reporter recognized it. "On March 15th, Emma continued, not waiting for the next question, "we were in the kitchen. My mom was at work, said he needed help reaching something from the high shelf. He said if I stood on the counter I could help him. I did. And when I was on the counter he touched my leg under my shorts. He touched me where he shouldn't have touched me." The specificity of the detail was devastating in its clarity. This wasn't vague accusation. This was the precise recollection of a traumatized child who, given the space and support to do so, could articulate her violation with devastating accuracy. "He told me it was okay," Emma continued, her voice now streaming like a river that had broken through a dam. "He said that dads touch their daughters like this sometimes, and that it was normal. He said I shouldn't tell anyone because mommy would get mad and it would ruin our family. He said it would be my fault if we broke up. I didn't want to break up my family, so I didn't tell anyone." Shifted in his seat. His face, which had maintained a mask of concerned innocence throughout the hearing, suddenly appeared strained. His lawyer placed a restraining hand on his arm, a warning gesture. Pressed forward, trying a different angle. "And you're certain this was March 15th? How can you be sure of the date?" "Because it was the day before my birthday," Emma said immediately. "My birthday is March 16th. I remember thinking he was doing this disgusting thing to me the day before I turned 8 years old. I remember thinking that this was how my birthday was going to start, with something horrible." The emotional precision of this detail struck everyone in the courtroom like a blow. This was the recollection of a child, yes, but it was the recollection of a child whose memory had been catalyzed by the support of Bailey's grounding presence. "There were other times too," Emma continued, not waiting for questions now. Her words were coming faster, her confidence building with each articulation. "Not just in the kitchen, in the car once, in the bathroom, in my bedroom when he came to say good night. Every time he touched me, he told me not to tell. Every time he said it was our secret. Every time I felt dirty and scared and confused." Sarah Mitchell, sitting at the attorney's table, maintained a professional expression, but her eyes held unshed tears. This was what she'd known was possible. This was why she'd fought for Bailey's presence in the courtroom. This was the credibility of truth finally emerging. Judge was writing now, not distractedly as he had been before, but with careful attention, capturing every word. The transformation in his demeanor was no longer subtle. His earlier contempt had been replaced entirely by focused judicial attention. He wasn't just listening, he was bearing witness to something he recognized as profoundly important. Officer stood at his post with a hardened expression. He'd worked custody cases for 2 decades. He'd heard fabrications and manipulations. He'd also heard the unmistakable ring of truth. This was truth. "How many times would you estimate this happened?" asked, his earlier aggressive tone now tempered. He was no longer attacking. He was simply following the script, perhaps hoping that continued questioning would somehow undermine the devastating clarity Emma had achieved. "I don't know exactly," Emma said honestly. "Maybe 10 times, maybe more. It's hard to remember every time, but I remember how it felt. I remember feeling scared every time he was around. I remember pretending to be asleep when he came into my room at night. I remember feeling relieved when my mom broke up with him." "And you never told anyone until 3 months ago." "I was scared," Emma explained, and the explanation itself demonstrated a sophistication of understanding that most 8-year-olds shouldn't have needed to possess. "I was scared that nobody would believe me. I was scared that I would get in trouble. I was scared that it was somehow my fault. My therapist explained to me that these are normal feelings for kids who have been hurt. She helped me understand that telling the truth was the brave thing to do." Exchanged another glance with, and what passed between them was unmistakable. The realization that the narrative he'd constructed was crumbling. The girl was credible. Her account was coherent. Her details were specific. Her understanding of her own trauma was profound. Sat in the gallery with tears streaming down her face, tears of relief and vindication. Her granddaughter was being heard. Her granddaughter was being believed. After months of wondering whether the truth would be sufficient, the truth was proving itself to be devastatingly sufficient. "I have one more question," said, and even his voice had changed. It carried less aggression and more the weight of a man realizing his case was failing. "Emma, I'm going to ask you directly. Did anyone tell you to make these accusations? Did your mother tell you to say these things? Did your therapist coach you into making false claims?" Emma looked directly at the lawyer, and in her 8-year-old face was a clarity and honesty that transcended her years. "No," she said firmly. "Nobody told me to say anything. My mom didn't want me to tell. She was scared about what would happen. My therapist helped me understand that telling was important, but she didn't tell me what to say. I'm saying these things because they're true, because they happened, because I need the judge to keep me safe from. That's why I'm here." The courtroom was absolutely silent. Even the ambient sounds, the slight hum of the air conditioning, the distant traffic outside, the creaking of the building's old bones, seemed to fade into insignificance. Sarah Mitchell stood. "Your Honor, I have no further questions for this witness at this time." Judge looked at, "Do you have further questions?" Sat back in his chair, defeated. "No, Your Honor, no further questions." What had transpired in the courtroom was nothing short of transformational. An 8-year-old girl, supported by a specially trained emotional support animal and a lawyer who believed in her, had articulated her trauma with such clarity and specificity that disbelief had become impossible. Judge had entered the courtroom that morning with mockery and skepticism. He was leaving it, at least for recess, with the indelible knowledge that he had almost allowed a child to be returned to her abuser because of his own rigid prejudice and refusal to understand the legitimacy of emotional support animals. Bailey remained with his head on Emma's lap throughout, his presence a constant reminder that sometimes truth requires support, and support can come in the most unexpected, most beautiful, most necessary forms. Judge didn't retreat to his chambers immediately after calling for recess. Instead, he sat at his elevated bench for several long minutes after the courtroom had cleared, staring at the empty witness stand where Emma had been sitting moments before. His mind was moving through the layers of what had just occurred, and the movement wasn't comfortable. It felt like excavation, digging through the sediment of his own assumptions to uncover truths he'd been ignoring for decades. He was a man accustomed to certainty. 32 years of judicial experience had given him the confidence that came from believing he understood human nature, that he could distinguish truth from falsehood, sincerity from manipulation. He'd built his reputation on being unmoved by emotional appeals, on maintaining judicial distance, on refusing to be swayed by the kind of sentimentality that he believed compromised legal reasoning. But what he'd witnessed in that courtroom had shattered that certainty in ways that were deeply, profoundly uncomfortable. Bailey, the dog he'd mocked as a circus performance, the animal he'd dismissed as a theatrical prop designed to manipulate his sympathies, that dog had done something extraordinary, something that Judge, for all his legal education and life experience, couldn't quite explain away with his usual skepticism. He thought about the signal, that precise tap on the dog's shoulder. That wasn't random. That wasn't sentiment. That was training. That was science. That was a deliberate therapeutic intervention, and it had worked in ways that contradicted everything his prejudice had told him would happen. Judge rose slowly from his bench and walked to his chambers, his movements heavy with the weight of reconsideration. He stood at his window, looking out at the city below, and allowed himself to confront something he rarely did, the possibility that he'd been wrong. When the recess was called, Sarah Mitchell had guided Emma to a private waiting room, one of the few spaces in the courthouse designed with some consideration for a child's comfort. Sat beside her granddaughter, holding her hand, whispering words of encouragement and pride. Bailey remained positioned protectively against Emma's leg, occasionally lifting his head to check on her emotional state. Emma was exhausted. The testimony had drained something essential from her, and she sat quietly, leaning against her grandmother, allowing herself to simply exist in the presence of people who loved and believed in her. That's when Officer appeared at the door to the waiting room. "The judge would like to see Ms. Mitchell in his chambers," he said. Sarah Mitchell's eyebrows rose slightly. It was unusual for a judge to summon an attorney during recess in such an informal manner. She gathered her files and exchanged a glance with Emma that was meant to be reassuring. "Stay right here. I'll be back soon." In Judge's chambers, the atmosphere was entirely different from the formal courtroom. The judge's private space was lined with law books, framed photographs of his family, and evidence of 32 years of judicial service. Certificates of achievement, photographs with governors and senators, awards of recognition from legal organizations. Judge sat behind his desk, but his posture had changed. The rigid formality had softened into something more contemplative. He gestured for Sarah Mitchell to sit. "Ms. Mitchell," he began, and his voice carried a weight that suggested this was a conversation he'd been rehearsing in his mind. "I need to understand something about that dog." Sarah Mitchell settled herself carefully, uncertain where this was leading but sensing the significance of the moment. "Of course, Your Honor. What would you like to know?" "The signal," Judge said directly. "The gesture your client made, that appeared to be a trained response. Can you explain how that works?" Sarah Mitchell took a breath, recognizing an opportunity she hadn't expected. "Your Honor, Bailey was trained specifically to respond to Emma's stress signals. The tap on his shoulder is one of several cues she was taught to use when she's beginning to experience a panic response. When she makes that signal, Bailey is trained to perform grounding techniques, in this case, placing his head on her lap and maintaining physical contact. The sustained pressure helps to interrupt the panic response and allows the person to reconnect with the present moment." Judge listened intently, nodding slowly. "This is a recognized therapeutic technique." "Yes, Your Honor. Emma's therapist, doctor, specializes in trauma-informed care for children. She's been working with emotional support animals for over 15 years. Bailey was trained by a certification program that specifically prepares dogs to work with trauma survivors. The training takes approximately 6 months and costs several $1,000s. The judge absorbed this information, and Sarah could see the wheels turning behind his eyes. He was connecting dots, revising his earlier assumptions. "I owe you an apology, Ms. Mitchell," Judge said finally, and the words seemed to cost him something. "And I owe your client an apology as well. I was prejudicial in my initial assessment. I allowed my personal skepticism to cloud my judicial reasoning, and in doing so, I nearly compromised a child's safety." Sarah Mitchell said nothing. There was nothing to say. The judge's acknowledgement of his error was significant enough. Judge stood and walked to the window, looking out at the city much as he had in his previous moment of contemplation. "I've been on the bench for 32 years, he said quietly. "I've presided over thousands of cases, and I believed I'd developed the capacity to recognize truth, but what I actually developed was rigidity. I became so convinced of my own ability to discern falsehood that I stopped truly listening. I stopped truly seeing." He turned back to face Sarah Mitchell. "I want to speak with Emma. Is that appropriate? Is that something you would recommend?" Sarah Mitchell considered the question carefully. "Yes, Your Honor, but it should be done away from the courtroom if possible, away from Mr. and his attorney. Emma needs to understand that this conversation isn't adversarial." Judge nodded. "Very well, can you bring her here?" Minutes later, Emma stood in the judge's chambers for the first time. Bailey remained at her side, and Sarah Mitchell stood slightly behind her, a protective presence. The judge's chambers suddenly seemed smaller, more human, less intimidating than the formal courtroom had been. Judge moved from behind his desk and positioned himself at eye level with Emma, not above her, not looming. He sat in a chair and looked at her directly. "Emma," he said, and his voice carried none of the earlier mockery or coldness. "I want to say something to you, and I want you to know that I mean it sincerely. I was wrong about you this morning. I was wrong about Bailey. I made assumptions about both of you before I heard what you had to say, and those assumptions were unkind and unfair." Emma looked up at him, her 8-year-old eyes wide with surprise. She'd never heard an adult, let alone a judge, apologize before. "What you did in that courtroom was extraordinarily brave," Judge continued. "You spoke about something that was deeply painful and deeply private, and you did so with a clarity and honesty that was remarkable. I was wrong to be skeptical of you. I was wrong to mock Bailey's presence. I was wrong, and I'm genuinely sorry." Emma's eyes filled with tears, but they were different tears than the panic-stricken ones from earlier. These were tears of relief, of validation, of an adult finally seeing her clearly. "Thank you," she whispered. Judge extended his hand gently, and Emma took it. His grip was warm and steady. "Your therapist is very wise," he said, "and Bailey is an extraordinary animal. Together, you've taught me something important today. You've reminded me that justice isn't about rigid rules and skeptical dismissal. It's about truly listening, truly seeing, and truly believing people when they're brave enough to tell the truth." He looked at Sarah Mitchell. "This case will be decided in my ruling, but I want you to know now that I have absolutely no doubt about the veracity of Emma's testimony. The evidence is clear. The corroboration will likely be strong, and the decision will be unambiguous." Sarah Mitchell felt tears prickling at her own eyes. This was justice working the way it was supposed to work, a judge hearing evidence, seeing truth, and having the integrity to acknowledge his own error and correct course. As Emma and Sarah Mitchell left the judge's chambers to return to the waiting room, Emma looked back at Judge. He smiled at her, a genuine smile, stripped of all the earlier contempt and filled instead with something that looked very much like respect. Bailey, sensing the shift in the courtroom dynamics, seemed to relax slightly. The grounding work was complete. The child had been seen. The truth had been acknowledged. Justice was finally moving in the direction it should have moved all along. The courtroom reconvened at 2:15 p.m. The afternoon light streamed through the high windows, casting long shadows across the marble floor. Every seat in the gallery had filled. Word had spread through the courthouse that something significant was about to occur. Lawyers waiting for their own cases had gathered to witness whatever Judge was about to do. Emma sat at the attorney's table with her hand resting on Bailey's head. The dog remained in his grounding position, his presence a steadying force. Sat immediately behind them in the first row of the gallery, her lips moving silently in what appeared to be prayer. Sarah Mitchell had her legal pads organized before her, though she already knew the substantive ruling would be in Emma's favor. What she didn't know was what Judge intended to say. Sat with his attorney, his face a mask of controlled anger. He knew. He'd seen it in the judge's demeanor during recess. The shift had been unmistakable. His carefully constructed narrative was collapsing, and there was nothing he could do to prevent it. Judge emerged from his chambers in his black robes, moving with a gravity that suggested this proceeding would be different from those that had come before. He took his seat and looked out over the courtroom. When his eyes found Emma, there was a flicker of acknowledgement, a private communication that said, "I see you. I believe you." "This court is back in session," the bailiff announced. Judge arranged his papers before him and began to speak. His voice was clear and carried the weight of careful consideration. "I have reviewed the evidence presented in this custody matter between Henderson versus. I have listened to the testimony of the minor child, Emma Henderson. I have considered the arguments of both counsel, and I am prepared to render my decision." He paused, and in that pause was the sense that something more than a simple ruling was coming. "Before I deliver the standard judgment in this matter," Judge continued, "I feel compelled to make a statement for the court record. I do this not often, and I do this only when I believe the matter is of sufficient significance to warrant such action." The courtroom had become absolutely silent. Every lawyer present recognized that they were about to hear something unusual, something that would likely be referenced and discussed for years to come. "When this hearing commenced this morning," Judge said, his voice carrying no trace of the earlier mockery, "I made a prejudicial determination regarding the presence of an emotional support animal in my courtroom. I dismissed the animal's presence as theatrical, as manipulative, and as inappropriate to serious legal proceedings. I expressed this dismissal openly, and I now acknowledge, disrespectfully." His attorney leaned close and whispered something to his client, jaw clenched. "What I witnessed during this child's testimony demonstrated that my initial assessment was not merely wrong," Judge continued. "It was dangerously wrong. This child, who had been subjected to sustained abuse and trauma, required specialized support in order to access her own capacity for truthful articulation. The emotional support animal provided not sentimentality or manipulation, but rather a scientifically grounded therapeutic intervention that enabled this child to communicate the truth of her experience with clarity and credibility." He looked directly at Bailey, and his expression was one of profound respect. "I have been on the bench for 32 years, Judge said. I have heard countless testimonies. I have made thousands of determinations. I pride myself on my ability to distinguish truth from falsehood. Yet in this case, my own rigidity nearly resulted in a profound miscarriage of justice. A child who had the courage to come to this courtroom and testify about her own violation nearly went unheard because I refused to recognize the legitimacy of her support system." Sarah Mitchell's hand covered her mouth. Tears streamed down her face. This was extraordinary. This was a judge publicly acknowledging systematic error and committing to change. "The law must adapt to the realities of trauma," Judge stated. "We now understand through decades of psychological research that trauma affects the brain's capacity for memory, articulation, and presence. Children who have experienced abuse often struggle to testify due to the nature of adversarial questioning in a formal courtroom setting. Specialized support animals, properly trained and utilized, Address this reality in ways that serve justice rather than undermine it. He turned to face Emma directly. This child's testimony was credible, detailed, and heartbreaking in its specificity. Her account of the abuse she suffered was corroborated by consistent psychological evaluation, by medical examination, and by the pattern of her trauma response. This court has absolutely no doubt regarding the truthfulness of her testimony or the reality of the abuse she experienced. Emma Felt's hand find her shoulder and squeeze. As to the relief sought by the petitioner, Judge announced formally, the court hereby denies the respondent's request for any visitation or contact with the minor child. The existing protective order is hereby strngthened with the following additional provisions. He read through a comprehensive list of restrictions, was prohibited from any direct or indirect contact with Emma. He was prohibited from being within 500 yards of her residence, her school, or any location Emma regularly frequented. He was prohibited from inquiring about her whereabouts or through any third party. He was ordered to pay child support and to participate in counseling for perpetrators of child sexual abuse. Furthermore, Judge continued, this court orders that any future visitation requests be reviewed in camera, meaning privately and without the minor child's knowledge. The burden of proof shall rest entirely with the respondent to demonstrate, with clear and convincing evidence, that such contact would be in the best interest of the child. Given the nature and severity of the abuse substantiated in this proceeding, this court believes such a burden will be extraordinarily difficult to meet. The gavel came down with a decisive crack that echoed through the courtroom. His face had turned a dark shade of red. His attorney was already packing his briefcase, aware that appeal was likely but that the evidence was damning and would be difficult to challenge. But Judge wasn't finished. I would like to address the legal community, he said, his words now directed at the lawyers and judges who had gathered to witness this proceeding. I am making this ruling available as precedent in emotional support animal cases. I am also formally requesting that the State Judicial Council consider implementing guidelines regarding the appropriate use of properly trained emotional support animals in courtroom proceedings involving vulnerable witnesses, particularly children who have experienced trauma. He looked at Sarah Mitchell. Ms. Mitchell, I commend you for your advocacy on behalf of your client. Your preparation, your integrity, and your commitment to justice have been exemplary. He then turned his gaze toward the gallery, where Doctor sat observing. I would also like to acknowledge the therapeutic work that has enabled this child to access her own truth. Trauma-informed care is not a luxury or an indulgence. It is a necessity in our legal system. Finally, his eyes returned to Emma. And to Emma Henderson, you have demonstrated courage today that will resonate far beyond this courtroom. You have not only protected yourself, but through your bravery, you may have changed how our entire judicial system approaches children's testimony. You should be profoundly proud of yourself. Emma felt tears streaming down her face, but they were different tears than the panic-stricken ones from earlier. These were tears of validation, of vindication, of finally being seen and believed. Stood and wrapped her arms around her granddaughter, holding her close. Bailey pressed against them both, his presence completing a circle of protection and love. The courtroom erupted, not in the traditional way of applause. Courtrooms maintain decorum, but in whispered conversations, in the movement of lawyers taking notes, in the understanding that something historic had just occurred. Officer approached and advised him that he was now subject to the protective order, and his attorney left the courtroom quickly, their humiliation complete. As Emma, Sarah Mitchell, and Bailey prepared to leave the courtroom, several lawyers approached to congratulate them. One older attorney, a man who'd been practicing law for 40 years, stopped Sarah Mitchell. That was the most important custody ruling I've witnessed in my career, he said. The judge is right. This will be cited. This will matter. Emma walked out of the courthouse into the late afternoon sunshine, Bailey at her side, her grandmother's arm around her shoulders, and Sarah Mitchell slightly ahead of them. The weight that had pressed down on her for so long had lifted. She was safe. The system had finally protected her. Justice had prevailed. The autumn sun hung low in the sky as Emma walked through the park near her home, Bailey's leash held loosely in her hand. They had become as much a part of each other as two separate beings could possibly be. Bailey had stopped being a support animal and had become simply part of Emma, her companion, her protector, her constant reminder that she was never truly alone. It was 6 months after the hearing. 6 months since the judge's gavel had come down with that decisive crack. 6 months of healing, of therapy, of slowly reclaiming the childhood that had tried to steal from her. Emma was no longer the terrified child who had walked into Judge's courtroom. She still carried the trauma that would take years to fully process, but she was no longer defined by it. She had a voice now. She had been heard. She had been believed. And most importantly, she was safe. But the impact of that day had extended far beyond Emma's personal safety. The case had become something larger, something that mattered to an entire system. 3 months after the hearing, Sarah Mitchell had received a phone call from Judge's office. The judge wanted to organize a formal presentation to the State Judicial Council about trauma-informed courtroom practices and the role of emotional support animals in child testimony. He wanted Emma's story to be the centerpiece of systemic change. Emma's mother had been apprehensive at first. The thought of her daughter's trauma becoming a case study, a matter of public record that would be discussed and debated, felt invasive. But Doctor had explained the potential impact. Other children, facing similar situations, could benefit from the precedent Emma was helping to establish. The protective procedures that had been implemented because of Emma's case could shield other vulnerable witnesses from that had nearly silenced her. And so, 6 weeks ago, Emma, along with her grandmother, Sarah Mitchell, Doctor, and Bailey, had traveled to the state capitol to present at the judicial conference. The presentation hall had been packed. 67 judges from across the state had gathered to listen to Judge explain the case, to hear Sarah Mitchell discuss the legal implications, to listen to Doctor present the science behind trauma-informed care and emotional support animals. But the most powerful moment had come when Emma herself took the podium. She was small, standing on a raised platform so the judges could see her. Bailey remained at her side, and in a voice that trembled slightly but carried absolute conviction, she had told her story to the judges of her state. She explained what it felt like to be disbelieved, what it felt like to have a judge mock her support system before even hearing her testimony, what it felt like to experience a panic attack while trying to tell the truth about her own violation, and what it felt like when Bailey's presence had allowed her to find her voice again. "I'm not special," Emma had said, her 8-year-old voice filling the chamber. "A lot of kids have been hurt like I was hurt. A lot of kids are scared to tell people about it. And a lot of kids get hurt more when they try to tell because nobody believes them or the people asking questions are mean. But Bailey helped me, and Doctor taught me, and I got to tell the truth and be believed. I want other kids to get to be believed too." There had not been a dry eye in the auditorium. Within 2 weeks of the presentation, the State Judicial Council had issued new guidelines. The guidelines established protocols for the use of emotional support animals in courtroom proceedings involving vulnerable witnesses. They mandated trauma-informed training for judges who worked with child witnesses. They created a certification process for support animals and their handlers, ensuring that only properly trained animals would be allowed into courtrooms. More significantly, the guidelines shifted the burden of proof. Judges could no longer simply dismiss emotional support animals out of hand. They had to articulate specific, evidence-based reasons for excluding them. The presumption had shifted from skepticism to openness. Judge had been appointed to lead the state's judicial task force on trauma-informed practices. He had resigned from his regular judicial duties specifically to dedicate himself to this work. In the 6 months since Emma's hearing, He had trained over 200 judges in trauma-informed courtroom procedures. He had become, somewhat ironically, one of the nation's leading experts on the subject. And it all traced back to that moment when he decided to listen. Now, walking through the park with Bailey, Emma didn't think much about any of this. She was 8 years old. She wanted to play on the swings and climb on the monkey bars and feel like a normal child. Bailey was content to walk beside her, occasionally stopping to sniff at interesting scents, acting like any beloved family dog. But behind Emma, documenting this moment, was a filmmaker named Michael, no relation to Doctor, who was creating a documentary about the case. The documentary, titled The Signal, was being developed for a major streaming platform. It would tell Emma's story in full context, not just the courtroom drama, but the therapeutic journey, the family's struggle, the systemic implications. Michael had been initially skeptical about the project. It seemed exploitative, using a child's trauma for entertainment. But Sarah Mitchell and Doctor had convinced him that the educational value would outweigh the invasiveness. The documentary could reach millions of people. It could change how parents, teachers, and counselors approached children who disclosed abuse. It could normalize the idea of emotional support animals. It could save lives. The documentary would air in 3 months, just before Emma's 9th birthday. Back at the courthouse, a new tradition had begun. Judge had started a monthly trauma-informed courtroom clinic, where judges, lawyers, therapists, and certified emotional support animals worked together to simulate challenging testimony scenarios. Lawyers practiced trauma-informed questioning. Judges practiced responding to vulnerable witnesses with compassion rather than skepticism. Support animals practiced their responses in courtroom settings. The goal was to ensure that the next Emma Henderson wouldn't have to fight as hard to be believed. One of the judges who regularly attended these clinics was Judge, a 60-year-old woman who had been on the bench for 28 years. Had initially been skeptical, she'd maintained a similar rigid approach to courtroom procedure as Judge had before his transformation. But after witnessing Emma's testimony through video recording, and after participating in the training clinic, she had her own transformation. "I've presided over hundreds of child custody cases," Judge said during one training session, "and I realize now that I've probably failed more children than I've helped. I was so focused on maintaining order and skepticism that I missed the obvious truth. Children who have been hurt need support to articulate their hurt. We should be providing that support, not mocking it." Her words resonated through the judicial system, like ripples spreading across still water. Emma didn't know about any of this as she played in the park. She was simply a child, enjoying sunshine and the company of her dog. Her grandmother watched from a nearby bench, cell phone in hand, occasionally capturing photographs of her granddaughter's moment of peace. Thought about how far Emma had come. From the terrified child gripping a dog's leash in a courthouse hallway to this, a confident girl laughing on a swing, fully engaged in the simple joy of childhood. The healing was incomplete. Trauma didn't work on a timeline that allowed for full completion, but it was real. It was happening. Sarah Mitchell was in her office downtown, preparing for her next custody case. She had become something of a specialist in child trauma cases since Emma's hearing. Other parents going through similar situations sought her out specifically because of her track record with Judge's landmark case. She was busier than she'd ever been, and her entire practice had shifted to focus on protecting vulnerable children in legal proceedings. Doctor was presenting at a national psychology conference about the integration of trained emotional support animals in trauma therapy. Her work, which had seemed fringe and experimental before Emma's case, was now mainstream. Universities were establishing programs to train emotional support animals specifically for courtroom use. Therapeutic protocols were being refined. Research was being conducted. All because one girl had the courage to tell the truth, and one judge had the integrity to listen. Emma called to Bailey, and the dog came running, his golden fur catching the last rays of afternoon sunlight. They headed toward home, where Emma's mother was waiting with snacks and homework and the simple love that comes from knowing your child is safe. The case file for Henderson v. remained in the state judicial archives, marked with a special notation, landmark decision, establishing precedent for trauma-informed courtroom practices and emotional support animal protocols. But to Emma, it was simply the day that her voice mattered, the day that someone powerful finally listened, the day that Bailey's signal changed everything, not just for her but for countless children who would come after her. As she walked home, Emma reached down and scratched behind Bailey's ears, the way he loved. The dog tilted his head, leaning into her touch, and in that simple gesture was a profound truth. Sometimes healing comes in the most unexpected forms. Sometimes salvation arrives on 4 legs and has a wagging tail. Sometimes courage looks like an 8-year-old girl and a trained golden retriever standing up in a courtroom and refusing to be silenced. And sometimes, if we're very lucky, the system listens and changes and gets better. For everyone. The end.